The document rests in a folder. The paper is thin, government issue, the kind manufactured in bulk for agencies that produce volumes of paper. No one outside the building is meant to read, and it sits in a manila folder whose tab has been marked only with a number, not a name, because the program it authorizes has not yet been given a name that anyone will be permitted to repeat outside a very small circle of offices in a building in Virginia. The date typed at the upper right of the first page is April 13th, 1953. Near the bottom of the page, a signature in black ink, the ink long since dry, the hand that made it belonging to Alan Welsh Dulles, who has been Director of Central Intelligence since January of the previous year and who signed this particular document on a Tuesday morning in early spring while the Capitol outside was moving through its ordinary routines. The folder is thin. It does not feel in the hand like a document of unusual weight. The paper inside it is specific about certain things: the program's authorization, its administrative home within the technical services staff, its stated justification, and vague about others, the vagueness deliberate, the specificity, a kind of technical framing that would allow the program to begin work through channels that existed at some remove from the agency's central accountability structures. It is a document that authorizes something by authorizing almost nothing by name. The signature is there, the date is there, the rest is, in the language of classified directives, operational detail to be developed through subsequent documentation that will itself be distributed across a filing infrastructure designed so that no single person holding any single piece of it can see what the whole looks like. The whole is what the folder is. The folder is what the signature begins. Outside the building where this directive is filed, Washington in April 1953 is a city moving through the second full year of the Eisenhower administration, past the end of the Korean War, but not yet past its consequences, in the early middle of a decade that has decided to think of itself as prosperous and stable, and has organized considerable institutional energy around maintaining that thought against everything that threatens it. The threats in this particular spring are understood to come primarily from the East, from a Soviet program that the agency believes to have advanced considerably in the fields of psychological manipulation, pharmacological coercion, and what the classified vocabulary of the period calls behavioral control. The word that the public uses, the word that arrived in American newspapers in the early months of the decade, is brainwashing. It is not a precise word. It was not intended to be. Edward Hunter, a journalist who had worked as a propagandist for the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War, published the word in a Miami Daily News article in September 1950, translating a Chinese phrase loosely rendered as HSI now, wash brain, and applying it to describe what he believed the Chinese Communist Party was doing to reshape the ideological commitments of civilians and prisoners. The word moved fast. It moved from journalism into congressional testimony, into classified memoranda, into the specific vocabulary through which the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence began articulating what it feared the Soviets had already developed, and what the agency believed it needed to understand, to replicate, and if possible to surpass. By 1953, brainwashing had become the public-facing shape of an institutional anxiety that was, in the classified space, considerably more technical than the word itself suggested. The anxiety had a specific recent event at its center. American prisoners of war returning from Korea had in a number of documented cases made public statements expressing sympathy with their captors' political positions, refused repatriation, or appeared to have undergone some form of psychological reorganization that the agency found difficult to explain through ordinary models of coercion and physical duress. 21 American servicemen declined to return to the United States when given the opportunity in 1953. More returned, having made statements or confessions that seemed inconsistent with their pre-capture beliefs. The question the agency's analysts were working on, the question that felt urgent enough to require a classified program authorized at the director level, was whether the Soviets and the Chinese had developed a reliable pharmacological or psychological method of producing these results, and if so, what that method was. The answer the agency suspected was yes. The program it was already running was designed to confirm the suspicion and to produce an American equivalent. That program was not MKUltra. MKUltra was the successor. The predecessor was called Project Artichoke, and it had been running since 1951 under the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, which had itself inherited a portion of its personnel and institutional interests from earlier wartime research programs that had found at the end of the Second World War that the question of psychological and pharmacological manipulation had produced considerably more investigation than answers. Artichoke ran experiments on hypnosis, drug-induced compliance, and combinations of psychological and chemical coercion applied to subjects who included prisoners, defectors, and foreign nationals. It operated at a classified facility in post-war Germany, a low building set behind a perimeter of wire, its windows opaque with condensation in the colder months, its location known to a small number of agency personnel and visible from the outside as simply a building in a landscape of other post-war administrative structures, unremarkable, its function invisible at street level. The subjects at that facility do not appear in surviving records by name. The records that would have carried their names were among those that did not survive the decades between the program's operation and the congressional investigations that came looking for them. What the surviving documentation establishes is that Artichoke was testing the same categories of intervention that MKUltra would subsequently fund at greater scale and through a wider network of institutional contractors. Hypnosis combined with pharmacological agents, prolonged psychological pressure applied within controlled environments, the deliberate manipulation of a subject's sense of time and perceived reality. Artichoke was the working prototype. MKUltra was the expansion, the institutionalization, the distribution of the program across enough separate nodes that the agency's central involvement would be difficult for any outside investigator to trace. The authorization that made MKUltra possible in April 1953 came at the end of a period of institutional maneuvering inside the agency about how the program should be structured and who should run it. The technical services staff, which in the ordinary course of its work provided the agency's operational personnel with the technical equipment and support necessary for clandestine activities, was designated as MKUltra's administrative home. This was not the obvious placement for a program ostensibly focused on psychological and behavioral research. It was a deliberate choice. The technical services staff operated with a degree of institutional autonomy that made it well suited to managing a program whose activities were not to be reviewed through the normal channels by which the agency's more conventional research programs were evaluated. The program would have a budget. It would have a chain of authority running to the director. It would have none of the oversight mechanisms that governed the agency's acknowledged programs. Allen Dulles had roughly 3 weeks before signing the April 13th directive made a public speech. This is one of the smaller details in the documentary record that the available evidence confirms and it is, once noticed, a peculiar one. On April 10th, 1953, Dulles spoke at a meeting of the Princeton Alumni Association in a lecture hall, whose wooden seats were, according to reports of the event, perhaps half filled, a midweek gathering, the kind of occasion at which a senior government official might speak in terms candid enough to satisfy a well-credentialed audience without saying anything that would be useful to anyone outside the room. Dulles spoke about what he called brain warfare. He described the Soviet threat in terms designed to be legible to a civilian audience that had been reading the same newspaper accounts of brainwashing that had been circulating for 3 years. He said the Soviets had developed techniques for altering human behavior that the United States needed to understand and counter. He did not say that a program designed to do exactly this was already past its planning stages and would, 3 days later, receive his signature in a classified directive waiting in a drawer back in Washington. The speech was the public face of an institutional decision whose classified interior was already formed. This is how the program inhabited 2 registers at once throughout its existence. There was a version of it that could be spoken about in front of an audience, and
framed in terms of national defense and the Soviet threat. And there was the actual program, running beneath that framing in rooms whose contents were not available to the audience in the Princeton Lecture Hall, or for many years
to anyone outside the small population of people whose institutional roles required them to know. The man who made the program operationally possible, who ensured it could be built and run at the scale the April 1953 directive imagined, was not Dulles himself, whose role was authorization, but Richard Helms, who served during MKUltra's early years as the CIA's deputy director for plans. Helms was a career intelligence officer who had joined the Office of Strategic Services during the war and moved into the newly formed CIA when it was established in 1947. His instinct for institutional management, for protecting operations through structural choices about how information flowed and who had access to what, was among the qualities that made him effective in the role, and that would later make the absence of MKUltra's records so complete. Helms ensured that MKUltra operated outside normal agency oversight channels. This was not an accident of administrative convenience. It was a specific structural decision, one that the agency's internal documentation from the period, in the fraction that survived, reflects as a deliberate choice about how the program should be insulated from review. The sub-projects that would come to constitute MKUltra's research network were distributed through intermediary institutions, front organizations, and cutout entities whose relationship to the agency was invisible to the universities, hospitals, and research centers that received funding through them. The design of this distribution was the design of plausible deniability applied at institutional scale. Each contractor saw a grant from a foundation. Each foundation's connection to the agency was hidden inside a corporate structure whose paper trail required multiple investigative steps to follow back to Langley. The researchers conducting the experiments, in many cases, did not know who was ultimately funding their work or why. The program this produced was not a single experiment or a unified research project. It was a network. By the time the historical record allows a reasonably complete count, MKUltra had been divided into at least 150 distinct sub-projects, each assigned a number rather than a name, each run through its own intermediary structure, each generating its own documentation that was supposed to be held at the level of the individual sub-project, rather than aggregated into any single record that would show the full picture. The number 150 appears in congressional testimony and in the surviving administrative records. It is almost certainly an undercount, because the administrative records that would have given investigators a complete tally of sub-project numbers were among the documents destroyed before any investigator had the opportunity to read them. Each number represented a separate institution. Each institution received funding through a channel that pointed, at the surface level, toward a foundation or a grant-making body with no visible connection to a government agency. Each institution employed researchers who were, in many cases, conducting work they understood to be legitimate scientific inquiry in pharmacology, psychology, hypnosis, or behavioral research. The connection between the work they were doing and the classified program authorizing and funding it was, for many of them, not a connection they were aware existed. This was the system working as it had been designed to work. The question of what Dulles knew, specifically about the content of the subprojects his signature authorized, is a question the record does not fully answer. The April 1953 directive authorized a program. The program generated subprojects. The subprojects generated research. The chain of authorization that ran upward through the technical services staff to the director's office was not the same thing as a chain of detailed briefings about what was happening in the rooms where the research was conducted. The agency's internal culture of compartmentalization, which was its primary operational security tool, applied inward as well as outward. What the director authorized and what the director knew, in practice, were not identical categories. This is a distinction the historical record supports without making it entirely comfortable to rest with. The authorization was real. The signature was real. The program that followed was real. Whether the distance between the signature and the rooms was a feature of institutional design or a consequence of deliberate incuriosity on the part of the officials who signed the authorizing documents is a question that the surviving evidence raises without resolving, and that the destroyed evidence can no longer be asked. The agency had by April 1953 already accumulated roughly 2 years of operational experience through Artichoke in understanding what pharmacological and psychological manipulation could produce under controlled conditions. That experience informed the scope and structure of what MKUltra was designed to attempt. The program was not beginning from nothing. It was scaling from a prototype, expanding an existing research program into a network large enough that the results from any single node of it could be understood in relation to results from dozens of other nodes, building a body of data about human psychological and pharmacological vulnerability that the agency believed would be necessary for both offensive and defensive intelligence operations. The word defensive appeared in the program's stated justification with some frequency. The program was framed in the documentation that authorized and managed it as a response to a Soviet capability that the agency believed to be real and advanced. The defensive framing was not dishonest in every particular. The fear of Soviet psychological capabilities was genuine, and the evidence base for it, while imperfect, was not simply invented. But the research the program funded was not only or even primarily defensive in its orientation. The techniques being developed were methods of controlling human behavior, inducing states of psychological compliance, and producing amnesia in subjects who had not consented to the procedures. These were tools that would be useful in interrogation and coercion as readily as they would be useful in countering an enemy's use of similar methods, and the program's surviving documentation reflects both applications as live interests rather than one as primary and the other as secondary. The program required money. The money required a mechanism. The mechanism was the network of front organizations, cutout foundations, and intermediary grant-making bodies that Helms's structural decisions made possible. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, which would later be reorganized under a slightly different name, was one. The Geschichte Fund for Medical Research was another. The Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation served in some cases as a conduit. Each of these organizations had varying degrees of genuine academic credibility, advisory boards that included real researchers, publication records that established a plausible institutional identity, grant programs that funded legitimate work alongside the work the agency was actually interested in funding. The structure was designed to be credible at the surface level, and for more than 2 decades it was the financial thread running from these organizations back to the April 1953 directive was real. It existed in the form of ledger entries, grant letters, progress reports, and correspondence between CIA officers and the administrative staff of the cutout organizations. It also existed in the form of financial records that survived by accident the 1973 effort to eliminate the program's documentary footprint. The survival of those records, 20,000 pages of financial and administrative documentation found in a storage facility in Maryland rather than at Langley, where the shredding had been done, is the reason the program's existence is documented rather than merely alleged. But in the spring of 1953, none of that archival future had yet been determined. The records were just being created, the folders were just being opened, the numbers were just being assigned. At CIA headquarters, in the offices of the technical services staff, a filing infrastructure was being constructed to manage what the April 13th directive had set in motion. The offices were fluorescent lit, as government offices of that period typically were. Long tubes of light running across dropped ceilings above rows of metal desks. The ambient hum of the bulbs present beneath whatever conversation or typing occupied the room at any given hour. File cabinets stood along walls. In trays accumulated documents. The administrative machinery of a classified program looks, from the outside and from this distance, indistinguishable from the administrative machinery of any other kind of bureaucratic operation. Proposals arrived and were reviewed. Numbers were assigned. Correspondence went out through channels designed to obscure its origin. Funding moved through accounts that pointed at the far end toward foundations and academic departments that received grant letters on ordinary business letterhead and filed them in their own administrative offices, alongside other external funding notices. The proposals that received sub-project numbers in the program's early years came from institutions whose letterheads reflected the genuine diversity of mid-century American academic and research culture. University psychology departments, medical schools, private hospitals and clinical research centers. Each proposal, in the form it presented to the receiving institution and to the cutout organization through which the funding moved, was a research proposal like other research proposals, a statement of scientific intent, a methodology, a budget, a list of the personnel who would conduct the work. Each proposal, in the form it occupied inside the CIA's filing system, bore a sub-project number and was connected to a classified program whose ultimate purpose the institutions receiving the funding were not told. The register that held these numbers was a bound volume of the kind used in government accounting and administrative record keeping, columns of figures, rows of entries, each entry carrying enough information to identify the sub-project and track its funding without carrying enough information in any single entry to give a reader a comprehensive picture of what the program as a whole was doing. The person holding the register saw numbers. Each number pointed toward a separate institution, a separate set of researchers, a separate group of subjects who would, in the months and years following the authorization of the directive that put them inside the program, find themselves participating in experiments whose connection to the United States government was not disclosed to them. The full picture existed only in the aggregate, in the sum of all the sub-project files, all the progress reports, all the financial records, all the correspondence. The full picture was visible, if it was visible at all, only to the small number of agency personnel whose institutional roles required them to see across the program's full administrative width. Even then, even for those individuals, what they held was the administrative picture, the numbers, the funding flows, the institutional names, and not the picture of what was happening in the rooms. The rooms were the content of the sub-project files. The sub-project files were distributed across a filing infrastructure designed so that the rooms remained separate from each other, connected only by the number system and the thread of funding that ran through the cutout organizations back to the technical services staff offices where the register was kept. The register was an ordinary government document. It was the kind of ledger produced in volume by the administrative machinery of any large institution that tracks and allocates resources across multiple distinct projects. It looked, to anyone who encountered it without the context of the classified program it documented, like a standard accounting record. The numbers in its columns were real numbers. The institutions associated with those numbers were real institutions. The funding amounts were real amounts. The program behind the numbers was real, and for the period of its operation it was known, in any comprehensive form, only to the agency that had created it, and to the small population of officials who had signed the authorizing directives and managed the administrative channels through which it ran. 150 numbers, 150 lines in the register, each line a separate institution, a separate piece of the program's total architecture, a separate set of research activities proceeding in separate rooms in separate cities across the United States, in at least one significant case in Canada, each room with its own personnel, its own subjects, its own documentation. Each documentation held at the level of the sub-project, accessible to the individuals managing that sub-project, and to the agency personnel responsible for overseeing it, not visible in its full context to anyone whose institutional position did not require them to see across the whole. The April 13th, 1953 directive that began this architecture was signed and filed. Its authorization set in motion the assignment of numbers, the construction of cutout organizations, the distribution of funding through channels designed to obscure their origin, the recruitment of research institutions whose administrators received grant letters and filed them without knowing the name of the agency that had written the check. The directive itself was thin, government issue paper in a manila folder marked with a number on its tab, the signature near the bottom of the first page in ink that dried decades before anyone outside a very small circle of classified offices knew the document existed. The folder sat in a filing cabinet. The filing cabinet sat in an office in the Technical Services Staff section of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The office had fluorescent lights and metal desks and in trays that accumulated paper. The paper in the trays was the accumulating record of a program now underway, sub-project proposals arriving, numbers being assigned, funding moving outward through its carefully constructed channels toward institutions that were receiving it without knowing its source, toward researchers who were conducting work whose classified context was, for many of them, completely invisible. The program would run for approximately 2 decades in this form, distributed, numbered, funded through channels designed to trace back to nothing the agency wanted traced, until the events of the early 1970s created the conditions in which the question of what the agency had been doing became for the first time a question that congressional investigators were positioned to ask. By then, much of the documentation that would have answered the question comprehensively was already marked for disposal. The classified ledger, with its 150 numbered lines, had already, in some sense, served its primary purpose. It had organized the program, tracked its components, and maintained the administrative infrastructure through which the agency managed what it had authorized in April 1953. Whether it would survive long enough to be read by anyone outside the agency was a question that had not yet been decided. What it held, in the years of its active use, was the shape of the program in its administrative form, not the rooms, not the subjects, not the results, but the numbers that stood in for all of those things, arranged in columns in a bound register that someone had to hold and update and file, the full picture of what those numbers represented, visible only to the person holding the ledger, and even that person seeing only the numbers, not the rooms. The Allen Memorial Institute stands on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal, its Victorian stone face lit at night in the particular way of buildings that have always appeared, from the outside, to be something they also are. The stone is pale gray in daylight and darker in the rain. The windows face the city below. Patients brought there in the late 1950s arrived at an address that appeared in no way unusual. A hospital on a hill, its entrance marked, its corridors staffed, its wards organized along lines that any visiting physician would have recognized as clinical. What was conducted inside some of those wards in the years between 1957 and roughly 1963 does not appear in the building's public history in any visible form. The records that would have described it in full were removed from the relevant files before any independent review was possible. The Allen Memorial Institute was where Subproject 68 ran. The funding for that subproject moved through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, a name that traces back through several layers of institutional architecture to the technical services staff of the Central Intelligence Agency. The money arrived at McGill University, carrying no visible marking of its origin. The researchers who received it were not, in most cases, informed of where it had come from or why it had been made available. The patients on whom the research was conducted were in nearly every case told nothing at all. Dr. Ewan Cameron was the subproject's principal investigator, and the experimental technique he had developed was a procedure he called psychic driving. The term appears throughout the surviving Subproject 68 documentation in Cameron's own clinical language, passive, technical, the phrasing of a man who regarded what he was doing as a rigorous scientific program and wrote about it in those terms. The technique involved the repeated playback of recorded messages to patients, statements about their psychological condition, their behaviors, their relationships, delivered on a continuous loop for periods that the documents record as extending to 20 hours a day, sustained across weeks, or in some cases months. The messages played through speakers positioned near the patient's bed, or through helmets fitted with small internal speakers and placed over the patient's head, or both. The rooms in which this occurred were otherwise quiet. The patients inside them could not, in practice, choose not to hear what was being played. A padded helmet of the kind Cameron used rests in contemporary photographs and descriptions as an ordinary-looking medical device. A helmet with a soft interior lining, small speakers embedded near the ears, a cord running to a recording apparatus on a metal cart beside the bed. The cart appears in the clinical documentation without particular emphasis. It is equipment. The recordings waiting to play on it were prepared by Cameron and his staff based on assessments of each patient's case, The messages constructed to introduce specific ideas about that patient's psychological state and to reinforce them through sheer repetition across sessions that the records describe in units of hours and cycles rather than in terms of what the patients inside them experienced. The lamp on the cart would have been warm. The room beyond the helmet would have been still. The loop would have begun again at the end, as it always did from the start. Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial did not exist in isolation from other experimental procedures he was developing during the same years. The psychic driving sessions were embedded in a larger protocol he called depatterning, a sequence of interventions designed to strip away what Cameron described as the existing psychological structure of a patient before attempting to rebuild it. The logic of depatterning, as it appears in Cameron's published papers from this period and in the surviving Subproject 68 records, was that certain psychiatric conditions had become so embedded in a patient's personality that conventional therapeutic methods could not reach them, and that the underlying structure needed to be cleared before anything else could take hold. The methods Cameron used to achieve that clearing are described in the records with the same clinical evenness that governs the rest of the documentation, which is its own kind of quality, language that does not change, register when the procedures it describes become extreme. Electroconvulsive therapy formed one part of the depatterning protocol. Cameron administered it at voltages substantially higher than those considered safe in standard clinical practice, and at frequencies substantially higher than standard clinical practice employed. Sessions delivered not once a week, as was common, but multiple times daily, across periods that extended for weeks. The records note the dosages and frequencies. The records note the outcomes in terms of confusion, disorientation, and memory disruption. The procedure was delivered to patients who had been admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute for conditions that the intake documentation describes, in most cases as treatable: anxiety, depression, behavioral difficulties that had brought them voluntarily or with family assistance to a hospital on a hill in Montreal where they expected to receive care. What they received instead was a procedure operating at parameters that had not been sanctioned by any ethics review and were not, in the terminology available at the time, therapeutic in any accepted sense. Prolonged drug-induced sleep was the second component. Cameron used barbiturates and other sedative compounds to keep patients unconscious, not for an overnight period, but for weeks at a time, sometimes longer. The records describe patients maintained in sedated states for periods measured in weeks, occasionally extending toward 2 months, with staff monitoring vital signs and managing the logistics of keeping a person unconscious for that duration in a clinical setting. The Subproject 68 documentation treats this as a pharmacological protocol and discusses it in those terms: compounds, dosages, duration, interruption schedules. What the documentation does not contain, because no such documentation was kept or has survived, is any record of what the patients understood about what was being done to them or whether they had agreed to it. Sensory isolation accompanied the sleep protocol. Patients returning to a state of partial wakefulness during the extended sedation periods were kept in reduced sensory environments, darkened rooms, limited external stimulation, the deliberate restriction of the kind of ordinary sensory input that a conscious person moving through the world receives continuously without noticing. The purpose Cameron described in his published writings was to make the patient available for the recorded message loops that would follow, a surface cleared for new input. The previous structure disrupted sufficiently that the psychic driving messages could find purchase where they had not before. That is the clinical framing. The experience, as survivors later described it in testimony, that the 1977 Senate hearings placed on record was the loss of continuous memory, the dissolution of ordinary knowledge about one's own life, the forgetting of names and dates and skills and facts that had previously been simply available, without effort, the way one's own name is available without effort, until it is not. The outcomes Cameron's depatterning protocol produced were documented in follow-up records that form part of the surviving sub-project 68 materials. Patients who had entered the Allen Memorial with treatable conditions emerged from the depatterning sequences with severe and frequently permanent amnesia. The records describe patients who could no longer recall significant portions of their own histories, not recent events alone, but years, decades, fundamental autobiographical material. Some patients lost functional skills they had possessed for their entire adult lives. The documents record these outcomes in the clinical register of progress reports, side effects listed, degrees of memory disruption noted, recovery timelines projected, with an optimism that the longer-term histories of the patients did not consistently support. Cameron continued the research. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology continued its funding. The reports traveled from Montreal back through the Society's offices, and eventually, by whatever route the financial infrastructure maintained, to the agency that had commissioned them. The sub-project at the Allen Memorial was one of the more extensively documented surviving pieces of MKUltra's research portfolio, which is partly a matter of geography and partly a matter of how filing decisions were made at the relevant institutions. Other sub-projects operated in other buildings, in other cities, under other institutional covers, and left different kinds of paper trails, some thicker, some nearly absent. Operation Midnight Climax produced a different kind of documentation, the kind that operational logs and later Senate testimony provide, rather than clinical progress reports and pharmacological records. It ran in apartments rather than hospitals, on streets in San Francisco rather than on a slope in Montreal, and its subjects were not patients who had arrived seeking treatment. The apartment at 225 Chestnut Street on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco was the first of the safe houses. It was later succeeded by the address at 261 Green Street, which is the one that appears more frequently in the testimony and the operational records, and which is the address that became, in the congressional hearing record of 1977, the clearest documented location associated with what the CIA had been running in the city. The apartment was furnished to resemble the kind of residence a certain kind of person in San Francisco in the 1950s might inhabit. Artwork on the walls that the operational records describe as erotic, a sideboard with drinks, furniture arranged in the manner of a social space rather than a clinical one. It was, on its visible surface, an ordinary apartment. The mirror set into one wall was not ordinary, and the corridor behind it was narrow and specific in its function. George Hunter White managed the operation. He was a career officer with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, brought into the Midnight Climax operation by Sidney Gottlieb, and supervised, at the level of the CIA's technical services staff, through the chain of authority that ran back through the chemical division. White operated undercover, identities, and kept personal diaries throughout his time running the San Francisco safe house, cloth-covered notebooks, their pages filled with dates and observations, and the shorthand of a man recording an operation from the inside. Those diaries became, after the 1977 Senate hearings brought the program's existence into the public record, some of the most detailed surviving documentation of what the safe house operation actually looked like from the perspective of the person running it. White himself described the work with a matter-of-fact quality that the diary's language carries throughout, an operational log in the voice of someone who treated the assignment as a professional task with practical parameters and administrative requirements. The ethical character of the task, not a question the document appears to have raised for its author. The subjects brought to the apartment at 261 Green Street were men who had been approached through the networks White and his associates cultivated in the city, networks that included sex workers who were paid to bring men to the apartment without disclosing the nature of what awaited them there. The men arrived expecting a social evening. Their drinks were dosed, in most cases without their knowledge, with LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, the substance Sidney Gottlieb had procured from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland, and that Subproject 3 had ordered in quantity for distribution across MKUltra's research network. The men who had been dosed did not know they had been dosed. The man or men in the observation corridor behind the one-way mirror watched and took notes, and the notes recorded behavioral responses in the language of an ongoing experiment. The one-way mirror was the operational center of the room. In a sense, it organized the relationship between the observed and the observer. On the apartment side, it appeared as an ordinary mirror, a rectangle of silvered glass set into the wall, the kind of thing that belongs in a furnished room, unremarkable in the context of the other furnishings. On the corridor side, it was a window, and through it the interior of the apartment was fully visible to whoever sat in the narrow passage with a notebook. The drinks on the sideboard were visible. The artwork on the walls was visible. The men who had been brought there and were now experiencing the effects of a substance they had not consented to take were visible, and what they did and said in the hours that followed was documented in the operational logs that George White and his associates maintained, and some of those logs survived the 1973 destruction, and some of those logs were part of the 20,000 pages that a FOIA request located in Maryland, years after the agency had believed itself clear of them. The CIA's stated purpose for the safe house operations was the evaluation of LSD as a potential tool for use in interrogation, specifically the question of whether the drug could be used to lower the psychological resistance of a subject in an interrogation setting, or to produce a state of suggestibility in which accurate information would emerge more reliably than it would from a subject who had not been dosed. The surviving records suggest that the research consistently produced evidence against the reliability of LSD as an interrogation tool, that the drug generated confabulation along with any genuine disclosures, that the subject's psychological state became unpredictable in ways that made the resulting information difficult to evaluate, that the tool the research was meant to validate was not in fact producing the results the validation was meant to confirm. The experiments continued regardless. The operational logs continued to be filed. The safe house at 261 Green Street continued to be furnished and staffed. The one-way mirror in the Green Street apartment was eventually removed when the operation closed, as all operations of this kind eventually closed. In the period after its removal, the mirror would have rested somewhere against a wall in a storage space, its silvered surface reflecting whatever happened to be in front of it, the room it had once looked into, no longer accessible to it. The corridor behind it, already repainted and returned to a condition in which it resembled an ordinary wall. A mirror is a passive object. What it once reflected is not recoverable from it. The operational logs that recorded what the mirror's observers watched are a different matter. Paper holds what was written on it, and what was written on it in that corridor, across the years the operation ran, is part of the reason the 1977 Senate hearings had the evidentiary basis to proceed in the specific detail they achieved. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, ran along different institutional lines than either the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal or the safe houses in San Francisco. It was a federal facility, the United States Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, also known as the Narcotics Farm, a sprawling institutional complex that housed people who had been committed for drug addiction, some of them voluntarily, and some through the criminal justice system. The population of the facility was, by definition, already subject to institutional authority in ways that the population outside it was not. The research that Harris Isbell conducted there under MKUltra subprojects was conducted within that pre-existing institutional structure, on subjects whose circumstances made refusal difficult, and whose consent, in any meaningful sense, was complicated by what they were being offered in return. Harris Isbell was the director of the Addiction Research Center. His work at the facility on the pharmacology of addictive substances and on the behavioral effects of various drugs was not conducted under MKUltra alone. His research program had a longer history and a wider institutional context. The MKUltra subprojects he participated in involved the administration of LSD to incarcerated heroin addicts in the facility's ward. The records that survived the 1973 destruction and that form part of the Rockville document collection describe the administration of LSD to subjects over consecutive day periods. The documented figure that appears in the surviving records and that was placed before the Senate subcommittee in 1977 is 77 consecutive days, the longest of the documented LSD administration sequences at Lexington, a period in which a single subject received daily doses of LSD across more than 11 weeks. The subjects were not told what substance they were receiving. They were offered heroin or other drugs as compensation for their participation, an arrangement that the records document plainly and that the congressional testimony did not contradict. The ward at Lexington in the late 1950s appears in the surviving documentation as a functional institutional space. Iron beds, a tiled floor, a window giving onto a courtyard, the ordinary physical inventory of a mid-century federal medical facility. The difference between this ward and any comparable ward in a conventional hospital lay entirely in what was happening inside it, and that difference is invisible in any purely visual description of the space. A ward is a ward. The beds are the same. The tiled floor is the same. The window and the courtyard and the institutional light are the same. What was different was the content of the small paper cups distributed to the subjects on the ward each morning, and the subjects inside it did not know what that content was. The question the research at Lexington was intended to answer, whether LSD and related compounds could produce reliable behavioral effects useful in interrogation settings, occupied several MKUltra subprojects across different facilities and different research protocols simultaneously. Barbiturates were studied as potential agents for lowering psychological resistance. Scopolamine, which had been used in the earlier Artichoke program as well, appeared in MKUltra subprojects, examining its potential as a truth-inducing compound. Mescaline was also studied within MKUltra's research network for its behavioral and psychological effects in interrogation-relevant contexts. The surviving documents that describe these investigations are clinical in their register. The compounds are named, the dosages noted, the behavioral outcomes recorded, the conclusions drawn and filed in the progress reports that the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology or other intermediary organizations received, and that the technical services staff processed at CIA headquarters. The consistent conclusion across the pharmacological subprojects, as the surviving records and testimony establish, was that no single agent reliably produced truthful disclosures without also producing confabulation that the subjects who were chemically compromised did not become more truthful, but became less reliable as sources of any information that could be evaluated. The research continued for years after those conclusions began to appear in the progress reports. The files contain evidence of that continuation. The sub-projects remained open and funded past the point at which the research rationale had already produced results that argued against the research goal. That is a particular quality of the record, the gap between what the experiments were finding and what the program continued to do with those findings, a gap that the documents themselves contain, because the progress reports and the funding records exist in the same files and can be read against each other by anyone who has the complete set. The complete set was not available to the Church Committee in 1975. It was not fully available even after the Rockville documents surfaced in 1977. What remains is a partial record, internally consistent in some of its sequences and fragmented in others, the conclusions legible and the full context of those conclusions, something that the destroyed files would have provided and cannot now. A declassified progress report from Subproject 68, one of the Cameron materials from the Allen Memorial, shows, in the version that the Freedom of Information Act requests of the late 1970s produced, a document whose margins carry handwritten annotations in ink that differs from the main text. The annotations are brief and technical. They do not change the emotional register of the document because the document's emotional register is entirely absent. It is a progress report, formatted as a progress report. The experimental procedures described in their sequence, the outcomes noted in their clinical terms, the data arranged in columns, and the narrative sections written in the passive voice that scientific reporting used and still uses to locate the action of the experiment in the procedure rather than in the person conducting it. The annotations in the margin were added later. They are questions, for the most part, written in a different hand, requests for clarification, requests for additional data, the marks of someone reading the report from a position of oversight and finding at certain points that the information provided was not complete. The questions in the margin were written in Washington. The experiments they were asking about were conducted in Montreal. The distance between those two cities is a fact of geography. The distance between the margin annotations and the experimental procedures they were questioning is a fact of institutional architecture. The separation of the funding source from the research site by the intermediary layer of the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, the deliberate blurring of the line between contractor and principal that was the design of the entire oversight structure from the beginning. A progress report with margin annotations is a document that has been read. It has been handled. Someone sat with it and went through it, paragraph by paragraph, and wrote questions in the white space beside the text. That is the most ordinary kind of document. It is the paper residue of someone doing their job, going through the materials they were responsible for reviewing, noting what needed to be followed up. That this particular document, reviewed in this ordinary way, described experimental procedures being conducted on patients in a hospital who did not know the procedures were occurring, does not alter the physical character of the document. The annotations are still annotations. The passive voice of the experimental description is still passive voice. The paper is still paper thin enough to see light through at the edge, the kind of government issue report paper that was used by the thousands of pages across a program that ran for more than a decade. What the sub-projects accumulated across the years they ran was a volume of documentation that the 1973 destruction order addressed systematically. The order did not preserve distinctions between research that had yielded actionable results and research that had not, between subprojects that had been operationally significant and those that had remained exploratory. The shredding was not selective in that sense. It addressed the record, as the paper infrastructure of a program that was being closed against the possibility of external review, and it moved through the files in the sequence that a shredding operation moves through files, which is to say, in the sequence that the files happened to be ordered, or in the sequence that made logistical sense to the people carrying out the order. Some files were not at Langley, some files were elsewhere. Some files were financial records and had been classified and stored by the criteria that applied to financial records rather than by the criteria that applied to operational records, and those criteria sent them to a records facility in Maryland rather than to the headquarters building where the shredding was carried out. That filing decision, made by someone whose name does not appear in any surviving account of the decision, is why there is a record at all. The surviving subproject, 68 materials, are not in themselves a complete picture of what Cameron conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute. They are the financial and administrative thread of that research, the funding requests, the budget justifications, the grant letters, the accounting of how money moved from the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology to McGill University, and ultimately to Cameron's laboratory. They confirm the relationship between the CIA's front organization and the research. They confirm the general categories of the research that was funded. They do not contain the full experimental protocols, the individual patient records, the complete documentation of what procedures were applied to which patients over which periods of time, because that documentation was either destroyed or was never part of what was filed with the intermediary funding organizations, and therefore was never subject to the FOIA requests that recovered what survived. What remains is a frame. The room that the frame once bordered has been in large part removed. The experimental results section of one surviving subproject 68 document has been reduced in the accessible version to a single surviving page. The page contains data, real data, specific figures, the kind of numerical record that a scientific study produces and that a progress report summarizes for the funding organization. The page has a context, a study with a design, a subject pool, a protocol, a duration, a series of measurements taken at specified intervals, and a set of conclusions drawn from those measurements. The single surviving page is the middle of that context. The pages that preceded it, the ones that would have described the study design, the subject selection criteria, the baseline measurements, the full sequence of the protocol, are absent. The pages that followed it, the conclusions, the recommendations for further research, the discussion of what the results meant in relation to the program's operational goals, are also absent. What remains is data without a beginning and without an end, figures that confirm something happened and record some of what was measured without providing the frame that would make the measurement fully interpretable. That document, one surviving page, its experimental results, sitting in the middle of a protocol whose edges have dissolved, is the image that the surviving record most consistently presents when examined closely. The subprojects were many, and the rooms they occupied were real, and the people inside those rooms were real, and what happened inside those rooms was documented in real paper that traveled through real institutional channels and was filed in real archive boxes. Some of those boxes reached Langley and moved into shredding machines in January 1973. Some of those boxes were in Maryland when the shredding happened, and they stayed in Maryland, and in 1977, a FOIA request found them on a shelf. What the boxes in Maryland contain is the surviving record. What the shredding machines consumed is the record that would have given the surviving pieces their full context, the beginning and end of the pages that remain, the protocols surrounding the single surviving page of experimental results, the full picture of which the partial picture is a fragment. The partial picture is, even as a fragment, detailed. The rooms it describes were real rooms. The instruments inside them, the helmet on the metal cart, the recording apparatus beside the bed, the mirror mounted in the wall of a furnished apartment on a hill in San Francisco, the ward at Lexington, with its iron beds and its tiled floor, are real objects that existed in real spaces and were used in ways that the surviving documents record. The people inside those rooms, the researchers, the operatives, the subjects who were patients or prisoners or men who had come to an apartment for the evening, were real people whose presence in those spaces the documents confirm. What the documents do not contain, because the pages that would have contained it are gone, is the complete accounting of how many rooms there were and how many people inside them, and what the full sequence of what occurred inside each of them looked like from beginning to end. A declassified subproject document whose experimental results section has been reduced to a single surviving page is still a document. It still holds what it holds. The page still contains the figures that were written on it, in the ink that was used to write them, in the clinical language that MKUltra's researchers used throughout the program to describe what they were finding. The data on that page is real data. The procedures it partially records were real procedures. The subjects those procedures were conducted on were real people. The pages that would have given this single page its full context, the pages that would have told the complete story of what this document was reporting and what was done with the findings it contained, are absent, and the particular way in which they are absent is the specific quality of the surviving record. Not empty, not complete. The piece of a protocol that remains after the shredders found the rest of it first, resting in a folder in an archive box, holding the data that was written on it, the beginning and end of its own story, dissolved into whatever came out the other side of a machine, running in Langley in January 1973, the silence around it, the silence of paper that has already outlasted everything else. A man crosses a parking lot in the early morning in the middle of a decade that still believed expertise was its own kind of answer. The lot is ordinary, painted lines, a few other cars, the low institutional building ahead of him, catching the flat light of a morning that has not yet warmed. He walks with a slight asymmetry, his left foot carrying a particular compensation through the gait that people who have known him for a while have simply stopped noticing. He carries a briefcase. Inside it, among the usual administrative materials, are procurement documents for a substance he has ordered in quantity from a laboratory in Basel, Switzerland, a substance so new that the agency's own chemists are still working out what it does, at which dose, under which conditions, administered to which kinds of people, in which kinds of rooms. The building ahead of him does not announce what it is. The staff inside it know him by a name connected to his role, not to the organization that sends his salary. He enters, the door closes, the parking lot returns to its ordinary silence, a few birds moving across the pale sky above the asphalt, the morning going on around the building as though the building were simply what it appeared to be. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. The briefcase was real. The procurement documents were real. The organization behind him was the Central Intelligence Agency, and the substance he had ordered from Sandoz Laboratories was lysergic acid diethylamide, a compound synthesized first in 1938 by a chemist named Albert Hofmann whose accidental self-dosing in 1943 had produced the first documented account of its effects, and whose laboratory had agreed to supply the CIA with quantities sufficient for research, whose parameters the agency had not shared with them. Gottlieb had been born in New York City in 1918, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, and had made his way through an education that ended in a doctorate in chemistry from the California Institute of Technology. He stammered. He walked with the compensated gait of a man born with a clubfoot. He had, by the accounts of people who encountered him professionally, an intensity of purpose that expressed itself not as visible urgency, but as the particular focus of someone for whom the question in front of him was always the most important one. On weekends and in the hours before and after work, he kept goats on a farm in the Virginia countryside, a detail the record preserves in the same neutral register it preserves everything else. The goats no more remarkable than the briefcase, the farm no more explanatory than the doctorate. These were simply the facts of a life being lived alongside the work. His official title was head of the chemical division within the technical services staff of the Central Intelligence Agency. The actual scope of what that role contained was broader. He managed the network of academic researchers, clinical contractors, and institutional cutouts through which the agency's mind control research was being conducted. He tracked the subproject numbers, corresponded with the contractors, received the progress reports, and made the determinations about which lines of inquiry warranted continued funding and which had reached their productive limits. He was, in the language of the documents that survived, the program's central operational figure, the person whose desk the money passed through, and whose signature, or whose initials, or whose telephone call sat at the origin of most of the significant decisions about what MKUltra actually did. He retired from the CIA in 1972, a year before the files were destroyed. He was never charged with a crime. He died in 1999 at the age of 80, survived by a wife and several children, having spent his final decades in what those who wrote about him afterward described as apparent equanimity. The record of what he managed runs to those 20,000 pages discovered in a Maryland storage facility 4 years after his retirement, a fraction, congressional investigators concluded, of what had once existed. The fraction is specific and detailed. It confirms the procurement. It confirms the subproject numbers. It confirms the institutions. It does not resolve in any complete way what Sidney Gottlieb understood himself to be doing, or what he believed the work required, or how those two things sat together in a man who kept goats and drove to work and signed documents in the ordinary hours of an ordinary working life. The desk at CIA headquarters, as it would have been arranged in the mid-1950s, is not difficult to imagine from the documentary record. Chemistry journals would have occupied the corner, the Journal of the American Chemical Society, proceedings from recent conferences on psychopharmacology, the occasional reprint from a European research group working in adjacent territory, a procurement ledger open to a current page, the entries in the careful notation of someone who understands that financial records are how programs are tracked, the address of a Sandoz Laboratories contact written on a notepad beside the telephone, in the handwriting of a man who had called the number enough times that the notation was convenience rather than reminder. The room would have been like other rooms in government buildings of that era, fluorescent lit, efficiently organized, the objects in it arranged to support the work rather than to express the person doing it. What made Gottlieb's desk different from other desks in other government buildings was the category of work those documents represented. Most of what passes across a government desk is administrative in a way that makes its moral weight invisible at the distance of the daily task. Gottlieb's work was not like that. The progress reports arriving from the contractors described procedures being conducted on subjects who had not been told they were subjects. The procurement documents described substances being acquired for administration without disclosure. The financial correspondence described grant money flowing through foundations constructed specifically to prevent its origin from being traceable by the institutions receiving it. These things were documented in the same register as everything else: units, dosages, budget lines, quarterly reports, and the record preserves them in that register, flat and particular, the administrative language carrying what it carries without inflection. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology had offices in New York City, and it functioned, to anyone who encountered it without knowledge of its origins, as a legitimate research foundation. The address was a midtown office suite. The letterhead bore the foundation's name in sober institutional type. The advisory board was composed of genuine academics, researchers with real affiliations, published work, reputations in their fields. The grant letters it issued were typed on that letterhead and routed through the normal administrative channels of the universities and research hospitals that received them. A grants coordinator at a receiving institution would have filed such a letter with the other external funding notices, the National Science Foundation awards, the private foundation grants, the occasional industry support, without any visible reason to treat it differently. The Society had been established in 1955, its funding traced through several layers of incorporation and intermediary organization back to the CIA. It was one of several front foundations specifically constructed for the purpose of channeling covert research money to MKUltra contractors while providing those contractors, and more importantly, their institutions, with a plausible account of where the money had come from. The Human Ecology Fund, which operated as a subsidiary, became the vehicle through which a significant portion of MKUltra's most sensitive research grants were delivered. The names were chosen with the same care that went into the sub-project numbering system. Unremarkable, slightly academic in register, the kind of organizational name that passes through administrative consciousness without leaving a mark. By the time the 1977 Senate hearings examined the Society's records, the foundation had been dissolved, and most of its operational files had not survived. What the hearings established, through testimony and through the financial records that had been preserved in the Rockville archive, was the mechanism, the way real academic credibility had been borrowed to insulate the agency from the programs it was funding. The researchers who received Human Ecology Fund grants were not necessarily aware of the CIA's involvement. Some of them were, some of them were not. The design of the system made that distinction largely irrelevant to the agency's purposes. What mattered was the plausibility of the cover, and the cover was plausible because the foundation looked real, behaved like real foundations behave, and issued grants that reached real researchers through real institutional channels. That a research grant arriving on Human Ecology Fund letterhead was indistinguishable from other foundation grants, that this was the point, that the indistinguishability was the design, is one of the facts the record establishes without particularly emphasizing. The archive simply contains the letters. They sit in their folders alongside letters from other foundations, filed in the order they arrived, their origin invisible at the distance of the filing cabinet. The credentials of the men the CIA chose to work with were in several cases not merely adequate, but distinguished. Donald Ewan Cameron was not a marginal figure in post-war psychiatry. He had been born in Scotland in 1901 and trained in medicine before developing a reputation in the emerging field of psychological research that carried him by the 1940s to positions of genuine institutional prominence. He was the founding president of the World Psychiatric Association, an organization whose creation he had helped bring about at a 1961 meeting in Montreal. He had served as president of the American Psychiatric Association. He had served as president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. He had, in 1945 and 1946, participated in the Allied assessment of Rudolf Hess at the Nuremberg trials, part of the team evaluating whether the former deputy Führer was mentally fit to stand trial, and the work he produced in that context was taken seriously by the legal proceedings that used it. A formal portrait of Cameron, taken sometime in the 1950s, shows a man in academic robes, the kind of image that appeared in conference programs, in professional directories, on the walls of institutions that wished to display their affiliations. The face in that image is not remarkable. It is the face of an accomplished man in the middle years of a long professional career, the kind of face that belongs in such a photograph that would not cause a viewer to pause or look more carefully, that this was also the face of a man whose patients were, at that moment, undergoing procedures their physician had designed and their institution had permitted, that the portrait and the procedures existed at the same time in the same professional life, is the particular quality of Cameron's case that the record preserves without comment. Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial Institute was funded in part through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. The Allen Memorial occupied a Victorian stone building on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal, a large turreted structure that had begun its life as the private home of a railway magnate before being donated to McGill University for use as a psychiatric facility. The building's exterior retains still the particular dignity of late Victorian stone, a facade that communicates stability, history, the reliable permanence of institutions. Inside, Cameron ran experiments he described in clinical language that has outlasted the man himself, preserved in the partial record the archive contains. What the documents that survive describe, in the language Cameron himself used, are procedures applied to patients who had come to the Institute with conditions that the clinical literature of the period considered treatable: anxiety disorders, depression, neurotic complaints of the kind that psychiatric practice of the 1950s routinely addressed with combinations of therapy and medication. What they received was something different. The technique Cameron called psychic driving involved recorded messages played through speakers or through helmets specially fitted for the purpose. For periods, the progress reports measured in hours per day, over days per week, over weeks per treatment course. The electroconvulsive therapy administered in the depatterning process operated at voltages the clinical literature of the period did not recommend, the sessions numerous, the intervals between them short, the cumulative effect on the patient's existing personality documented in Cameron's own notes as the intended outcome rather than the unfortunate side effect. The CIA's interest in Cameron's work was specific. The depatterning process, the combination of induced sleep, electroconvulsion at elevated parameters, and sensory isolation, was understood by the agency as a potential method for erasing existing psychological content and creating, in the resulting blank, a foundation on which new behavioral patterns might be installed. Whether this theoretical possibility ever produced a reliable operational result is a question the surviving documents do not resolve. What the documents do confirm is that the research was funded, that it continued over years, and that the patients on whom it was conducted did not know they were subjects in a CIA-funded research program. The gap between Cameron's public profile and the content of his research files is not in the end a mystery that requires elaborate explanation. Institutional systems of the kind Cameron operated within, academic psychiatry, hospital administration, professional association governance, do not routinely examine what their most prominent figures do inside their clinical wards. Credentials produce trust. Trust produces freedom from scrutiny. The formal portrait in the conference program and the progress report in the research file belong to the same career, and the career belonged to a man whose professional world provided him with both the resources to conduct the research and the standing to conduct it without interference. George Hunter White did not have Cameron's kind of credentials. His background was law enforcement, a career officer with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who had spent years working in the particular register of the post-war American drug enforcement world. Surveillance, informants, the cultivation of sources in the criminal networks that supplied American cities with opiates. He was a big man, physically substantial, with the manner of someone for whom operational improvisation was a professional identity rather than a departure from protocol. He kept diaries. This was, in retrospect, the most significant thing about him. White was recruited by Gottlieb to manage the safe houses through which Operation Midnight Climax ran its San Francisco experiments, apartments furnished to serve as plausible civilian spaces, with the particular domestic details that suggested ordinary habitation rather than government operation. The apartment at 261 Green Street was furnished with erotic artwork on the walls, drinks on a sideboard, the general arrangement of a certain kind of bohemian San Francisco flat. Behind a mirror, set flush into one wall, ran a narrow observation corridor, where White, or one of the operatives working under him, would sit with a notebook taking observations on subjects who had been brought to the apartment and dosed with LSD without being told what they had received. White's diaries recorded the operations in a voice that the people who later read them found instructive for reasons beyond their operational content. The entries described the work in the register of a man who experienced his assignment as a kind of elevated bureaucratic adventure, the voice of someone for whom the ethical dimension of the project was not a present consideration, but an absent one, the way certain questions are simply not the questions one is occupied with. The diary entries are specific about dates and observations. They are specific about the operational details. They are not, in any entry the record preserves, occupied with the question of what it meant to conduct the operations on the people inside the apartment, on the other side of the mirror. The mirror itself, a rectangle of silvered glass designed to admit observation from one side while reflecting from the other, is the kind of object that carries, by the time it appears in a historical account, more weight than it would have carried in the room where it hung. In the apartment, it was furniture. In White's diary, it was a fixture. In the later Senate testimony of the people who investigated the program, it became a specific architectural detail, confirming that the operations had been conducted with the degree of deliberate arrangement that the agency's own records had not fully described. After the San Francisco operation closed, the objects that had furnished it were disposed of or relocated. The one-way mirror, if it survived at all, would have become what mirrors become when they are removed from the walls that gave them purpose, a reflective rectangle leaning against a wall in a storage room, its surface offering back whatever the room contains, the observation corridor behind it, no longer connected to anything. The operation it had served having moved on or ended, the record does not specify what happened to it. The record specifies what happened in front of it in the language of White's diaries and the operational reports they corresponded to. White's papers, which he donated to the special collections at Foothill College in California before his death in 1975, became one of the sources through which researchers reconstructed the operations the agency had not preserved in its own archive. This was not because White intended his diaries as a documentary contribution to the historical record. It was because he kept them, and because he kept them in the particular detail of a man who found his own life consistently interesting. The papers arrived at the archive in the condition of personal documents, a cloth-covered notebook alongside correspondence, the operational observations alongside the personal ones, the voice throughout consistent and particular and entirely unguarded. What the diaries confirm, alongside the partial records surviving in the Rockville archive, is that Operation Midnight Climax ran for approximately a decade, that the subjects dosed in the San Francisco apartments were not told they were receiving any substance at all, and that the operational reports from these observations made their way back to Gottlieb's desk at CIA headquarters, where they were filed in the sub-project system, alongside the reports from the academic contractors and the clinical institutions, in the same flat administrative register that the program used for everything else. The CIA's method for distributing MKUltra research was, by the design of the people who constructed it, specifically intended to prevent any single institution or researcher from gaining a comprehensive view of what the program as a whole was doing. The 1977 Senate hearings produced an estimate drawn from the surviving financial and administrative records, suggesting that at least 80 institutions had participated in the program in some capacity. The estimate identified at least 44 colleges and universities among them. Stanford University was among the institutions named. Georgetown University was among those named. The list in the full record is longer, and the names on it represent institutions that in most cases knew only the portion of the program that had come to their campus, the grant from the Human Ecology Fund, the research parameters described in the proposal, the progress reports submitted by their own faculty. The architecture of this distribution was the work of the same people who designed the front foundations and the cutout organizations, Gottlieb and the small group of technical services staff personnel who managed the sub-project ledger. The design was not a post hoc rationalization, but an original intention. The program was structured so that its full shape was visible only from the center, and even at the center it was visible only as a ledger of numbers and funding flows, not as a coherent picture of what was happening in the rooms where the research was actually conducted. A university department receiving a Human Ecology Fund grant would have known the research parameters it had agreed to. It would have known the principal investigator. It would have known the reporting schedule. What it would not have known was the identity of the funding source behind the foundation, the sub-project number under which its work was tracked, the existence of the other 43 universities contributing to the same program, or the operational purpose toward which its research was being directed. The distance between what a receiving institution knew and what was true about the money it had accepted was one of the program's deliberately produced conditions, maintained through the layering of the foundation structure and the careful compartmentalization of information at every level. This was not unique to MKUltra. Intelligence programs of the post-war era routinely used cutout structures to maintain plausible deniability and operational security. What distinguished the MKUltra distribution from other programs was the scale of the academic community it enrolled, the depth of the concealment it required of that community, and the nature of the research it was funding. Work conducted in a significant number of cases, on human subjects who had not been told they were subjects and had no meaningful ability to decline participation in a program they did not know existed. The formal portrait of Cameron, the goat farm in Virginia, White's cloth-covered diary, the Sandoz Laboratories address written on the notepad beside Gottlieb's telephone, the grant letter on Human Ecology Fund letterhead. These are the textures of the program as it actually ran, not abstraction, not ideology, but the specific objects and arrangements through which people carried out, across more than a decade of working days, a research program whose scope and methods would not become public until the decade after it ended. Gottlieb left the CIA in 1972. He had held his position for roughly 2 decades. The filing cabinet in his office area at CIA headquarters, whatever its exact configuration, whatever its location in the building's floor plan, would have contained, in 1972, the accumulated administrative record of those 2 decades. Sub-project files, organized by number, correspondence with contractors, organized by institution, procurement records, organized by substance and date, progress reports, organized by sub-project and period, financial summaries, operational logs. The full infrastructure of a research program that had run across the entire Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson administrations had survived personnel changes and organizational restructurings and at least one internal review, and had produced a quantity of documentation that the people who later investigated it could only estimate from the edges of what had not been destroyed. In 1972, that documentation still existed. The drawer of a filing cabinet, opened in that year, would have revealed hanging folders in the standard colors of the era's office supply catalogs, each folder's label tab marked with a sub-project number or a contractor's name or an administrative category. The papers inside them, progress reports, procurement forms, grant letters returning through their various institutional channels, correspondence in the flat professional language of mid-century American government bureaucracy, held the record of what had been done and to whom and where and with what results, in the detail that administrative records carry when they are kept by people who believe that what they are documenting is authorized and institutional and will remain internal. The destruction order came a few months later. The shredding machine ran through the folders in a room somewhere in the Langley building. The record that had accumulated across 20 years moved in the space of days from the filing cabinets to the shredder to whatever disposal process received the strips. What remained, accidentally, in a storage facility in Maryland was a fraction of the financial and administrative materials, 20,000 pages that survived because they had been classified differently, filed in a different location, never sent to the building where the shredding was carried out. But that destruction is a different moment in the program's history, and what it produced, the congressional testimony, the Senate hearings, the partial reconstruction from surviving records, is the work that came after Gottlieb's papers still existed in their drawer. What the drawer contained in the last months before the destruction order was a complete record, sub-project by sub-project, contractor by contractor, the full administrative map of a program that had touched dozens of institutions across 2 continents, had enrolled thousands of subjects without their knowledge, and had produced findings whose operational utility the agency itself had concluded was in many areas limited. The labels on the folder tabs were visible. The papers inside them were in their original order. The record was intact. It was intact for a few more months. Then it was not. The man who had overseen the goat farm carried the briefcase across the parking lot, written the address of the Sandoz contact on the notepad beside the telephone, managed the sub-project ledger through 2 decades of classified working days. That man retired before the order came. The filing cabinet in the office he left behind held for a time the record of everything he had managed. The labels on the folder tabs were still legible. The papers inside them still carried whatever they carried. The drawer, if one were to stand before it in those last months, would have opened the way filing cabinet drawers open smoothly, in the way of a drawer that has been opened many times before in the ordinary morning hours of an ordinary working day, by a man who walked with a particular gait across the parking lots of buildings that did not announce what they were. A drawer in a filing cabinet at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, was pulled open sometime in January 1973. The folders inside it hung in their metal runners in the particular order someone had arranged them years before, labeled organized, each one a record of something that had happened in a room the folder described but did not fully explain. The labels were visible for however long it took a pair of hands to lift the folders out in batches. Then the folders moved down a hallway toward a machine that was already running, and the labels were visible for a few seconds more, and then they were not. The destruction of the MKUltra files was not carried out in a single afternoon. The volume of material was too large for that. What the congressional investigators who later tried to reconstruct the process were able to establish is that the shredding and incineration of documents at Langley proceeded over a period of days. The work methodical and thorough in the way that bureaucratic processes tend to be when the people carrying them out have been given clear instructions and sufficient time. Sidney Gottlieb oversaw the process. He had managed the program for years. He understood what the files contained and what their existence would mean in a congressional hearing room, and the order to destroy them had come from the top of the agency. Richard Helms had issued it before he left his post as CIA director. The timing was not incidental. The Watergate investigation was expanding in ways that had begun to pull adjacent threads, and the atmosphere in Washington in early 1973 was one in which intelligence agencies had reason to anticipate scrutiny they had not faced before. The files that moved through the shredding machines at Langley represented, at the end of it, approximately 150 sub-projects, research proposals that had gone from the technical services staff to intermediary foundations and then to university departments, progress reports typed on clinical letterhead and mailed back through cutout organizations to handlers who filed them in the folders that were now being fed through the machine. Financial records that traced, if followed carefully enough, from classified accounts through proprietary foundations to the laboratories and hospitals where the research had been conducted. Correspondence between agency officers and academic contractors who often did not know or did not ask the full name of the organization paying for their work. Operational logs from the safe houses in San Francisco and New York. Whatever documentation had existed for the experiments conducted at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington. The clinical records from the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal that the agency had retained on its own side of the arrangement, the internal assessments of which substances had worked and which had not, and the names that appeared in those assessments. All of it went through the machine, and the strips that came out of the machine were collected for incineration, and what had taken years to accumulate took days to reduce to something that could not be read. Congressional investigators looking at this process 2 years later would describe the destroyed materials as representing only a fraction of the documentation they would have needed to conduct a full accounting of the program. That phrasing, only a fraction of what would have been needed, is itself a kind of measurement. It implies a total volume that was never recovered, a body of evidence that existed once and does not exist now, and a permanent limit on what any investigation would be capable of establishing. The Church Committee, convened in January 1975 under Senator Frank Church of Idaho, ran into this limit almost immediately. The committee had been established in the aftermath of a broader set of disclosures about intelligence agency activities. The Watergate fallout had opened doors that had not been opened before, and MKUltra was among the programs it set out to examine. The committee members arrived with prepared questions and legal authority to compel testimony. What they could not compel into existence was the paper that had been reduced to strips and then to ash 2 years before the committee was formed. The Church Committee hearings on MKUltra proceeded. Then, on the basis of what the witnesses could be persuaded to say and what those witnesses had reason to remember accurately and reason to minimize, former CIA officials testified before the committee with answers that had been shaped, consciously or otherwise, by the fact that the documents which might have tested those answers no longer existed. The committee's investigators noted in their final reports that this constraint was fundamental, that the destruction of records had not merely reduced the evidence available, but had altered the entire character of the investigation, turning it into an exercise in reconstructing a program from the recollections of people who had run it and who had institutional reasons to describe it in the least alarming terms the facts would bear. What the Church Committee was able to establish about MKUltra was real and significant. What it acknowledged it could not establish was, by its own accounting, considerably larger. The hearing rooms during the Church Committee proceedings had a particular quality that records of the period convey. Long tables, witnesses seated at microphones, committee members working from briefing documents that summarized a body of evidence everyone in the room knew was incomplete. The questions were careful and specific. The answers were careful and sometimes vague in ways that the absence of documentary contradiction made impossible to challenge. Senators who had prepared their questions based on what the surviving record showed found themselves confronting the blank where the fuller record should have been. The process was not without result. It established that MKUltra had existed, that human subjects had been used without their knowledge or consent, that the program had operated outside normal agency oversight channels for years. These were not minor findings. They were simply findings made in the particular condition of a record that had been deliberately thinned before the investigation began. There is a specific quality to the silence that comes after documents have been destroyed. It is not the silence of an absence that was always there, an event that was never recorded, a meeting where no notes were kept. It is the silence of something that was present and is no longer present, a gap with edges that can be felt even when the gap itself cannot be crossed. The investigators working from the Church Committee's documentation understood this distinction. They were not encountering a program that had left no trace. They were encountering a program that had left traces everywhere. Its research had touched an institution, a researcher, a subject, a financial account, and whose central organizing files, the records that would have tied those traces into a coherent picture, had been removed from the picture before the picture could be assembled. The difference between those two situations is the difference between a story that was never told and a story that was told, and then someone cut out most of the pages. The 2 years between the destruction of the files in January 1973 and the convening of the Church Committee in January 1975 passed without public knowledge that either the program or its records had existed. The broader population had no way to know that a filing cabinet at Langley had been emptied, or that the strips of paper it had contained had been collected and burned, or that a formal program of government-funded research on human subjects had been running for 20 years under a classification so tight that even most of the people inside the CIA did not know its full scope. The Watergate investigation had made the names of certain agency officials newly prominent. It had not yet made MKUltra a known quantity. The gap between those two facts, between the destruction of evidence and its eventual partial recovery, is approximately 4 years. And in those 4 years, the program existed only in the memories of the people who had run it, and the partial traces it had left in institutions that did not know what they were holding. The Freedom of Information Act had been amended in 1974 in ways that made it substantially more useful as an instrument for reaching government records than it had been before. The amendments were a consequence of the same political atmosphere that was also producing the Church Committee, a period in which congressional skepticism about intelligence agency conduct had reached a point where legislative action was possible in ways it had not been for years. Researchers and journalists who had been following the edges of the story that was becoming visible through the Watergate disclosures began submitting FOIA requests to the CIA in the mid-1970s with increasing specificity. John Marks, a journalist who had worked for the State Department and was writing what would eventually become a book about the CIA's mind control research, was among them. His requests, submitted to the CIA's records office, asked for documents relating to programs the agency had conducted on human subjects. The initial responses he received asserted, with the formal language of official correspondence, that essentially all relevant records had been destroyed, and that the surviving materials would not allow for a comprehensive response to his requests. That was what the record showed from the position of the people responding to it. It was not, it turned out, what the record actually contained. Somewhere in the administrative decisions that had preceded the 1973 destruction, a distinction had been made. The distinction was not, apparently, a deliberate act of preservation. It was the kind of distinction that gets made in large bureaucratic filing systems when different categories of records are routed to different storage locations, a procedural separation rather than a considered choice. The records that Gottlieb had overseen the destruction of at Langley were the operational and research files, the sub-project folders, the progress reports, the correspondence, the experimental records in their most direct and explicit forms. A separate category of MKUltra-related documentation had been classified as financial and administrative records. Financial and administrative records in the agency's filing infrastructure were routed to a records facility in Rockville, Maryland, rather than stored at Langley headquarters. They had been sent to that facility before 1973. They were sitting there in archive boxes indistinguishable from the other archive boxes surrounding them when the shredding machines ran at Langley. The people running the shredding machines had not been sent to Rockville. Nobody had been sent to Rockville. The records there were not destroyed because they were not at Langley, and they were not at Langley because a filing decision made years earlier by someone following an administrative routing protocol had sent them somewhere else. The CIA records facility in Rockville, Maryland, is not a building that announces itself. It sits in a commercial district, low and functional, the kind of structure that could be a warehouse or an administrative office or a storage company, depending on the signage on its front. Inside it, in the mid-1970s, the shelves ran floor to ceiling in the way that archive storage facilities require, each shelf holding rows of identical archive boxes bearing alphanumeric labels that encode a filing system legible to the people who work within it and opaque to anyone approaching it from outside. One of those boxes on one of those shelves held approximately 20,000 pages of MKUltra related documentation. The box looked like the other boxes. Its label was in the same format as the labels on the boxes beside it. There was no visible reason to distinguish it from the materials on either side of it, and for several years after the Langley destruction, it sat in its row without being disturbed. The response that John Marks received from the CIA, the one asserting that essentially all relevant records had been destroyed, reflected what the people composing that response believed to be true. They were not, it appears from subsequent accounts, deliberately concealing the Rockville materials. They were responding to a FOIA request on the basis of their understanding of where the responsive records had been held and what had happened to those records in January 1973, and their understanding was incomplete in ways that the filing decision from years earlier had made invisible. The gap between what the agency's FOIA office believed it held and what it actually held was not a gap created by the 1973 destruction. It was a gap that had always existed in the agency's knowledge of its own distributed filing system, and the Rockville box had been sitting in that gap, undisturbed, waiting for someone to look in the right place. The discovery of the surviving documents in 1977 was the result of a FOIA request that prompted a search more thorough than the searches that had preceded it. The precise chain of events that led CIA personnel to look at the Rockville facility specifically, rather than continuing to respond on the basis of the Langley destruction, involves administrative details whose full reconstruction depends on records that have been partially released and partially withheld. What the surviving account shows is that at some point in 1977 was the result of a FOIA. A search of CIA holdings produced the archive box in Rockville, and the box was opened, and the approximately 20,000 pages of financial and administrative records inside it were identified as MKUltra related materials that had not been included in the 1973 destruction. The people who found the box had not been looking for it specifically. They had been looking for responsive records, and this was what the search found. The 20,000 pages were not the program's complete record. They were the program's financial and administrative residue, the documentary trace of money moving through cutout foundations to institutional contractors, the budget requests and grant disbursements and overhead calculations that had governed the program's financial infrastructure. They were not the experimental results, not the case files, not the detailed subproject records that the operational files would have contained. They were the money trail, and the money trail turned out to be enough. The materials recovered from Rockville confirmed, in the specific language of financial documentation, what the church committee had been told in the general language of official testimony, that the CIA had funded research at a substantial number of institutions through intermediary organizations, that the research had involved human subjects, and that the program had been designed from the beginning to obscure the agency's role in it. Budget lines led to foundation grants. Foundation grants led to university departments. University departments led to researchers whose work the documents described in terms that were clinical and administrative, but whose implications, read carefully, were clear. The financial records confirmed the scale of the program in a way that testimony had been unable to, not because the witnesses had lied, necessarily, but because financial records are more resistant to modulation than recollections. A payment has a date and a recipient and an amount. Those three facts taken together are more stable than a former official's account of a program he had reason to characterize carefully. It was the recovery of these documents that made the August 1977 Senate hearings possible in their particular form. Senator Edward the 1000th, Kennedy convened the hearings before the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research after the surviving documents were disclosed, and the hearings proceeded with the 20,000 Rockville pages as their documentary foundation. CIA Director Stansfield Turner appeared before the subcommittee and delivered testimony that the room received in a silence that had been building for years. The overhead lights in the Senate hearing chamber reflected off the long table's surface in a way that photographs of the proceedings preserve. Turner read from a prepared statement that acknowledged, in the formal language of official testimony, that the CIA had sponsored research on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. He acknowledged that the 1973 destruction of files had made a complete accounting of the program's activities impossible. He acknowledged that the surviving documents represented a partial record, that the financial materials from Rockville had not been destroyed along with the operational records, and that the agency was now prepared to make those materials available to the committee. The hearings of August 1977 were, in terms of what they produced for the public record, a significant moment. They confirmed the program's existence with documentary evidence rather than solely on the basis of testimony. They established that the CIA's own director was willing to stand before a Senate subcommittee and acknowledge that human subjects had been used without consent and that the program had been conducted outside the normal channels of accountability. They produced a public record that had not existed before. What they did not do, and what Turner's own testimony was careful to acknowledge, was resolve the question of what the destroyed records had contained. The 20,000 pages from Rockville were what they were: financial and administrative materials from which significant portions of the program could be inferred but not directly established. The experimental records, the detailed subproject files, the case histories, these were absent, and their absence was a permanent condition, not a temporary gap that further research might eventually close. There is a particular quality to the 20,000 pages as a documentary resource that researchers who have worked through them describe in similar terms. The pages are specific in what they address and silent about almost everything the specificity points toward. A grant disbursement to a researcher at a named institution is a specific fact. The research that disbursement funded is invisible in the document itself, recoverable only from external sources, the researcher's own records, the institution's archives, whatever partial documentation survived on the receiving end of the money. The pages tell the shape of the program without telling most of what happened inside that shape. They are like the floor plan of a building without the room's contents, or the accounting ledger of a project whose work products have been removed. The shape is real, and the shape is traceable, and the shape is in itself considerable evidence. But the space the shape enclosed is not in the 20,000 pages, and it is not anywhere else, because the machines at Langley ran for days in January 1973, and what they reduced was what would have filled that space. The years between 1977 and the present have added layers to what the surviving record shows, as additional FOIA requests have produced additional partial releases, and as researchers have assembled the documentary picture from multiple archival sources. John Marks's book, published in 1979 and based substantially on the Rockville documents, combined with other public and private sources, demonstrated what could be reconstructed when a researcher worked carefully across the full available record rather than from a single collection. Subsequent declassifications have added individual documents and partial subproject records that survived at institutions other than Langley, universities that retained their own copies of correspondence, researchers who kept personal files, institutions whose own archives happened to preserve materials that the Langley files would have duplicated. Each additional piece has extended the picture somewhat. None of them has replaced what was destroyed. What the surviving record establishes, taken in aggregate, is the outline of a program that ran for approximately 20 years, funded research at a minimum of 80 institutions by the 1977 Senate hearings estimate, involved at least 150 distinct subprojects, operated through a layered system of financial intermediaries specifically designed to prevent any single institution from understanding the whole, and produced experimental results whose full extent the remaining documentation does not permit a complete accounting of. The program's authorization is documented, its financial infrastructure is documented, the names of its principal officers and contractors are documented. The nature of its research is documented in the fragments that survived at institutional archives and in the records of the congressional hearings. The program's complete experimental record, the full case histories of its subjects, the internal assessments that would have given the surviving pieces their proper context. These are not documented because they were the materials that went through the machine. The question of what a complete record would have shown is not a question the existing evidence can answer. The Church Committee acknowledged this in its findings, and the 1977 Senate hearings acknowledged it again, and researchers who have worked through the Rockville documents and the subsequent declassifications continue to acknowledge it in their published work. The acknowledgement is not a rhetorical gesture toward mystery. It is a precise statement about the relationship between an archive and the events the archive was created to record. When the operational files of a 20-year program are destroyed before they can be examined, the limit that creates for historical understanding is not temporary and not theoretical. It is permanent and it is specific, and it describes a body of knowledge that is simply no longer accessible. The records facility in Rockville has not changed its essential character since 1977. Archive storage facilities accumulate materials at a pace that reflects the volume of classified documentation the government produces, and the shelves that held the MKUltra financial records in the mid-1970s now hold other materials alongside whatever portion of the original discovery remains accessible to researchers. The building sits where it sat. The boxes on its shelves have accumulated different labels over the decades since the 20,000 pages were found. The filing system that had routed the financial records there, rather than to Langley, the administrative decision that had created the gap in which those pages survived, is itself a historical artifact now, a procedural distinction made by someone following a protocol whose consequences that person could not have anticipated. The shredding machines that ran at Langley in January 1973 have long since been replaced by newer equipment. The room where the process occurred has presumably been used for other purposes in the 50 years since. The strips of paper that came out of the machines were collected and incinerated, and what the incineration produced has been gone for decades in the way that burned paper is gone, not retrievable, not partially recoverable, simply absent in the total way that combustion produces. The files that survived in Rockville survived because of the gap between where they were stored and where the destruction was carried out, a gap created by a filing convention rather than by any deliberate intention to preserve them. The accident of it, the bureaucratic routing decision that placed financial records in a different location from operational records, and the thoroughness of a destruction that reached the operational records but not their financial counterpart, is what the surviving archive is built on. There is something in that particular accident worth holding for a moment. The 20,000 pages that formed the documentary foundation for the 1977 Senate hearings, the pages that confirmed the program's scale and institutional reach and financial architecture, survived not because anyone hid them or protected them or made a decision about their value. They survived because someone, years before the destruction order was issued, had followed a standard filing protocol that sent one category of records to Rockville and kept another category at Langley. The person who made that filing decision did not know what was in the files. The person did not know that a destruction order would eventually be issued. The person was following a protocol, filling a box, labeling it correctly, sending it to the right storage location according to the administrative rules that governed that kind of decision. The protocol was not designed to preserve evidence. It was designed to manage the logistics of large volumes of classified documentation in a way that kept the administrative records separate from the operational records. That separation, created for administrative convenience, turned out to be the reason that any documentary record of the program survived at all. The archive box that came off the shelf in Rockville in 1977 sat in a climate-controlled storage room for approximately 4 years between the destruction at Langley and the moment it was found. In those 4 years, it held its contents in the particular patience that paper holds things, undegrading, unchanged, waiting with no awareness of waiting for a researcher's FOIA request to send someone to look for it. The label on the box was unremarkable. The contents were indexed but had not been reviewed. The box was accessible in principle to anyone with the appropriate clearances who knew to look for it, and for 4 years nobody looked for it because nobody knew it was there. It was found because a search was thorough enough to reach it, and it was found intact because the administrative decision that had placed it in Rockville rather than Langley had also placed it outside the reach of the destruction that had been carried out in January 1973 with the specific intention of leaving nothing to find. The box sits in the historical imagination of everyone who has worked with its contents in its row on the shelf in the Rockville facility. The label visible, the box indistinguishable from the boxes beside it, the 20,000 pages inside it holding the financial outline of a program whose operational record no longer exists. The box was not supposed to survive. Nothing about the decisions made in January 1973 was designed to leave it intact. It survived because of where it was, and it was where it was because of a filing decision made years before by someone following a protocol. And the protocol had nothing to do with MKUltra and everything to do with how one kind of record was distinguished from another kind of record in a bureaucratic system managing large volumes of classified material. That distinction, made for administrative convenience, is the reason the program's financial architecture is documented. It is the reason the 1977 hearings had documentary evidence to work from. It is the reason the program's history can be traced at all, rather than existing solely in the memories of the people who ran it and the partial institutional traces it left in places the destruction could not reach. The box in Rockville, holding its contents in the quiet of a climate-controlled storage room, is where the documentary history of MKUltra rests, not in the complete operational record that was destroyed, but in the financial residue that survived because it was somewhere else. In a row of identical boxes on a shelf that received it years before anyone decided the rest of the program's files should no longer exist. Deep Creek Lake sat still in the early dark of a November evening in 1953, the water holding the last gray light of a sky that had already given up on warmth for the year. Inside a retreat building on the property, a small group of men had gathered around a table. There were drinks. There was conversation of the kind that moves between professional subjects and easier ones, the way it does when colleagues are briefly away from the building where they ordinarily work. The lake lake was visible through the window. The surrounding trees had already lost most of their leaves, and the property had the particular quiet of a place that belongs to one season and is waiting for another to complete its work. One man at the table was a U.S. Army bacteriologist named Frank Olson. His drink, the record would later establish, was different from the others. He did not know this yet. The evening continued. The lake held its reflection of the darkening sky, indifferent to everything taking place at the table inside. Frank Olson worked as a contractor for the CIA, employed by the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He was 37 years old. He had a wife, Alice, and 3 children. The November gathering at Deep Creek Lake was a work retreat attended by colleagues and by Sidney Gottlieb, the head of the CIA's chemical division, who had decided that the evening's drinks would include a quantity of LSD administered to several attendees without their knowledge or consent. This was consistent with the program's approach to a number of its experiments during this period. The substance was introduced, the subject was unaware, and whatever followed was observed, and in some cases recorded. What followed in Olson's case was a profound psychological disturbance that did not resolve in the days after the retreat ended. He returned home, altered. His colleagues noted the change. He was described in later accounts as anxious, withdrawn, troubled in ways that his ordinary professional demeanor had not prepared the people around him to interpret. He was brought to New York to see a physician. He was taken to the Statler Hotel on 7th Avenue, where he was placed in the care of a CIA-connected doctor. On the morning of November 28, 1953, 9 days after the evening at Deep Creek Lake, Frank Olson fell from the window of his room on the 10th floor and landed on the street below. He was pronounced dead. The cause was recorded as suicide. His family was told he had jumped. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about Deep Creek Lake. They were not told about the CIA's involvement in the days preceding his death, or about the physician who had been assigned to him, or about the circumstances that had placed him in that hotel room in the first place. The file on Frank Olson's death was held in CIA custody. The agency's internal understanding of what had occurred that November, the retreat, the dosing, the psychological deterioration that followed, remained inside the institution, inaccessible to the family that had been told only that a husband and father had, without explanation, jumped from a window in New York City. Alice Olson raised their 3 children without that information. The years passed, the program continued. The files remained where they were, in the administrative structure of an agency whose official position, if asked, would have been that no such program existed. It was not until 1975 that the Olson family was informed of any part of what the CIA knew about Frank Olson's final days. The Church Committee's investigation had surfaced the basic facts of the Deep Creek Lake dosing, and the Ford administration brought the family to the White House, where President Ford offered a personal apology. The CIA's director at the time confirmed that Olson had been given LSD without his knowledge. The family received a financial settlement and a private congressional bill allowing them to sue the government, a bill that was ultimately not pursued because the terms of the settlement required them to waive further legal action. What the family received in 1975 was a partial account. The question of how Frank Olson died, whether the fall from the 10th floor was, as the CIA's account maintained, a suicide committed by a man in severe psychological distress, or something other than that, was not addressed by the official acknowledgement of the dosing. Eric Olson, Frank's son, who had been 9 years old at the time of his father's death, spent decades pursuing a different understanding of what had happened at the Statler Hotel. In 1994, he arranged for his father's body to be exhumed from its burial site in Frederick, Maryland, and examined by a forensic pathologist. The examination produced findings that the medical examiners described as consistent with homicide, specifically evidence of a blow to the head that they concluded had occurred before the fall, not as a consequence of it. The forensic findings did not produce criminal charges. The official record was not formally revised. The determination that Frank Olson had died from a fall, the basic fact recorded in 1953, was not formally overturned by the 1994 examination, even as that examination raised questions the existing record could not answer. The case remained what it had been since the beginning, a documented fact at the center of an incomplete file, surrounded by the absence of materials that would have made the picture whole, held at a permanent distance from resolution by the ordinary passage of time and the deliberate destruction of records. In January 1973, Eric Olson continued his investigation. He did not stop. The forensic report sits in the record. The question it raises sits in the record beside it, and the record does not close. The Allen Memorial Institute still stands on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal. It is the same Victorian stone building it was in the 1950s, when Ewan Cameron ran his research program inside it. The same exterior, the same windows looking out over the grounds, the same institutional presence on the hillside that made it visible from the city below as simply a hospital, the kind of building whose function is legible from the outside in the most ordinary terms. What occurred inside it during Cameron's years there was not visible from the outside. It was, in the most administrative sense, a research program proceeding under a series of research grants, funded through a foundation whose connection to the CIA was not apparent from the letterhead, proceeding at the pace and with the documentation of a clinical enterprise that considered itself scientifically legitimate. The patients who passed through Cameron's procedures during those years had been admitted, in many cases, for conditions that the psychiatric vocabulary of the time considered treatable: anxiety, mild depression, the kinds of presentations that brought people to a hospital rather than kept them away from one. What they encountered inside was a program designed around Cameron's conviction that the existing personality could be erased, that through sufficient chemical sedations, electroconvulsive therapy applied at voltages many times the clinical standard, and the enforced repetition of recorded messages played directly into a patient's ears for hours at a time across days and weeks, the mind could be reduced to a state from which it might then be rebuilt. The theory did not survive its own evidence. The patients who underwent the full sequence of procedures Cameron called depatterning did not emerge rebuilt. They emerged changed in ways that were permanent and that the clinical language of the time was not adequate to describe, because what had been removed from them was not a symptom, but a coherence, the continuity of memory and function and selfhood that had existed before they arrived at the Allen Memorial Institute on the slope of the mountain in Montreal. The CIA funding that supported this research had been channeled through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, a foundation established specifically to provide a plausible non-governmental source for research grants, whose actual origin was an intelligence agency. Cameron received the funds and conducted the research. The patients inside the institute were not informed of the funding source. They were not informed of the CIA's interest in the outcomes. They were not, in many cases, informed in any meaningful way of the nature of the procedures they were undergoing or the experimental basis on which those procedures rested. The 1977 Senate hearings confirmed the CIA's funding of Cameron's work. This confirmation opened a legal pathway that had not existed before, because it established a connection between an American government agency and the harm that had been done to Canadian citizens inside a Canadian institution. The litigation that followed was slow. The legal and jurisdictional complexities were genuine. The agency's position throughout was that it had funded research, not procedures, and that the specific clinical decisions Cameron had made were his own professional choices, made without CIA direction or oversight of their implementation. Velma Orlico had been a patient at the Allen Memorial Institute in the late 1950s and early 1960s. She had gone to Cameron seeking treatment and had undergone both depatterning and the psychic driving process, the recorded loops, the helmets, the weeks of chemically maintained sleep. She emerged from the experience with lasting psychological harm that she carried for the rest of her life. Her husband was David Orlico, a member of Parliament representing a constituency in Winnipeg, and this fact gave her case a political dimension that cases without such connections did not have. She became one of the most prominent of the plaintiffs in the litigation against the CIA. Her name appeared in newspaper coverage. Her husband's position meant that the case had a public face, a political context, a presence in the Canadian parliamentary record that other cases belonging to people without institutional connections did not acquire. The litigation proceeded through the American court system across most of the 1980s. In 1988, the CIA agreed to an out-of-court settlement with 8 Canadian plaintiffs. The settlement paid approximately $750,000, distributed among the 8 individuals. There was no admission of liability. The agency did not acknowledge that what had been done to these individuals was wrong, or that the funding it had provided had contributed to harm. The settlement was an administrative resolution, the kind of outcome that closes a legal proceeding without requiring either party to accept the terms the other party has advanced. For the 8 people who received it, it was a number on a check and the end of a legal process that had consumed years of their lives. For the larger population of Cameron's former patients, many of whom had not been party to the litigation, it was a settlement that did not include them. The Canadian federal government moved separately. In 1992, a compensation program was established for qualifying survivors of Cameron's depatterning procedures. The payment was set at 100,000 Canadian dollars per recipient. Approximately 77 former patients ultimately received payments under this program. The program required documentation, medical records, evidence of treatment, some form of corroborating record connecting the claimant to Cameron's procedures during the relevant years. For survivors whose records had survived the ordinary attrition of time and institutional filing, this was navigable. For those whose records had been lost or whose documentation had been incomplete even at the time it was created, the threshold was harder to reach. The program provided acknowledgement to those who could be verified by the available record. The available record was not complete. The building on Mount Royal still stands. The corridors inside it are ordinary and quiet. The history inside its walls has never been marked by anything visible from the street, nothing that would pause a person walking past the building on an ordinary afternoon and suggest that the institution visible from the outside is also, at some depth beneath its current function, the location of something that took place 60 years ago and was never fully accounted for. The stone of the building does not remember. The records that survive in partial archives do. The patients who are still alive carry what no document can hold in the same way they have always held it, which is in the body and in the gap where continuous memory should be and is not. There is a category of harm that the MKUltra record carries, and cannot fully document because the destruction of files in January 1973 removed the possibility of a complete accounting. The Operation Midnight Climax safe houses in San Francisco operated across a period of years, dosing men who arrived at the apartments on Chestnut Street and then on Green Street without any knowledge of what the apartments contained or what would be introduced into their drinks. The men who were dosed in those rooms were not, for the most part, identified. Their names were in documents. Their names were in operational logs kept by George White, whose personal diaries would later become some of the most revealing evidence of what the operation involved. The operational logs that identified specific subjects, the dates, the quantities, the observations recorded by operatives watching from behind the one-way mirror set into the far wall of the Green Street apartment, were among the materials that did not survive 1973. What this means in practical terms is that there are people, or were people, in the decades when they were still living, who had an experience in a room in San Francisco in the 1950s or early 1960s that they could not explain, a drink that produced effects they did not anticipate and could not account for, an evening that became strange in ways that had no ordinary framework. They left the apartment and returned to their lives carrying a memory of something that had no name for them, no context, no explanation, because the explanation existed only in a document they were never meant to see, and which, after January 1973, no longer existed at all. The gap between what happened to them and what they could have known about what happened to them is permanent now. The record that would have bridged it is gone. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, ran its own program of drug administration to incarcerated subjects across a period documented in the records that survived. The subjects were heroin addicts serving sentences at the federal facility. They were offered heroin or other drugs as compensation for participation. They were not told what substance they were being given. The record shows administrations of LSD extending across periods documented as lasting 77 consecutive days. What the subjects understood about what was happening to them during those days, what framework they had for interpreting an experience produced by a substance no one had named for them, what lasting effects they carried into the years after the research ended. These are questions the surviving record addresses only partially, and the portions of the record that would have addressed them most directly were among those that did not survive. The Church Committee heard testimony from former CIA officials in 1975. The Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research heard testimony in 1977. Admiral Stansfield Turner, the CIA director, acknowledged before the 1977 committee that the agency had sponsored research on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. He acknowledged that the 1973 destruction of files had made a complete accounting impossible. These acknowledgments were made on the record in a hearing room before a committee of the United States Senate. They are part of the public record. They establish the basic facts with the authority of official institutional admission, which is a different kind of weight than the weight carried by the declassified documents themselves. The difference between the paper trail and the voice that confirms the paper trail accurately describes what it appears to describe. What the testimony and the surviving documents together establish is a program that ran across roughly 20 years, involving at least 80 institutions, at least 44 colleges and universities, an unknown number of individual research subjects, and a deliberate administrative architecture designed to prevent any single party from holding a complete picture of the whole. The program was authorized at the highest levels of the agency. It was funded through mechanisms designed to conceal its origin. It was conducted by researchers who, in many cases, held the most prestigious credentials their professions could confer. It ended, formally, in 1973, not because its methods had been found wanting in ethical terms, but because the director who had overseen it was leaving his post and wished to ensure that what it had contained would not be available to investigators who might ask questions about it. The program was terminated, and then, days later, its records were destroyed. These two facts sit beside each other in the archive. What remains after the destruction and the investigations and the settlements and the testimony is a partial record. The 20,000 pages recovered from the Rockville facility in 1977. The financial and administrative records that survived because they had been filed at a location other than the headquarters where the shredding occurred represent a fraction of what existed. They confirm the program's existence, its funding mechanisms, its institutional reach. They confirm specific subprojects and specific amounts and specific institutional affiliations. They do not reconstitute the research protocols, the subject logs, the progress reports, the operational records of what was done inside the rooms where the experiments took place. Those are gone. The partial record is the record that exists, and it is all that will ever exist, because the materials it is partial without cannot be recovered. There are researchers who have spent careers with this partial record. John Marks, the journalist whose Freedom of Information Act request set in motion the discovery of the surviving Rockville documents, spent years building from what the financial records implied toward the outlines of what the missing research records would have confirmed. His work, and the work of others who followed him into the available archive, produced the fullest account the record currently supports. That account is specific and well documented in the places where documentation survived, and silent or inferential in the places where it did not. The silence is not a failure of research. It is an accurate representation of the archive. The survivors of Cameron's procedures, who submitted compensation claims to the Canadian government in 1992, filled out forms that asked them to document harm that had in many cases altered the entire shape of their subsequent lives. Memory loss that was not temporary, loss of functional capacity that had not returned, the particular damage of not knowing, for years, whether what had been done to them had been done with their consent or against it, because the procedures had been presented to them within a clinical relationship that implied the authority of medical expertise, and the question of what they had actually agreed to, in any informed sense, was one the record did not cleanly answer. The compensation form could hold a name and a date and a list of procedures. It could not hold what those procedures had removed. Approximately 77 people received payments from the Canadian Compensation Program. The number is specific and verifiable. It is also almost certainly lower than the number of people who experienced lasting harm from Cameron's research, because the record that would have identified all such individuals was itself incomplete, and because the requirement of documentation created a threshold that some survivors could not reach. The settlement the CIA reached with 8 plaintiffs in 1988 covered 8 people. The full plaintiff class from which those 8 emerged was larger. The full population of people harmed by the programs those plaintiffs' cases represented was larger still. The program's administrative design, the distribution across institutions, the use of intermediary foundations, the compartmentalization that prevented any single institution from holding the complete picture, meant that the full extent of its reach was obscured, not only to investigators after the fact, but to the institutions participating in it during the years it ran. The Deep Creek Lake property in western Maryland still exists. The Retreat Building, where the November 1953 gathering took place, has been altered over the intervening decades. The specific rooms, the specific arrangement of the interior, the window through which the lake was visible that evening, have changed or been replaced or overlaid by later occupancy. The lake itself has not changed. It holds the same position in the same low hills of western Maryland that it held in November 1953 when it was visible through the window at the table where Frank Olson sat with his drink and did not know what was in it. The water has the particular stillness of a lake in winter, the surface flat and cold, the surrounding trees bare against a sky that at this time of year closes early and holds very little light. The evening that took place there in 1953 is not visible in the water. It is not recoverable from the property. It exists in documents, partial documents, the ones that survived, and in the testimony of people who were present and who are now dead, and in the forensic record produced by an examination conducted 41 years later, and in the official record that preceded the exhumation, in which the exhumation called into question without formally resolving. The record does not close on Frank Olson. It opens into a question that sits with the other unanswered questions the archive carries, patient and specific, neither pressing for resolution nor releasing itself from the file. His death is documented. The circumstances preceding it are partially documented. The question at the center of the 1994 forensic findings has been asked, officially, in the language of medical examination, and has not been answered in the same language, and the official record stands where it has always stood, which is in the position of an account that was completed before its subject was fully known. The archive box in Rockville, the one that was filed at the Maryland facility rather than at Langley, the one that did not reach the shredding machines in January 1973, contains materials that have been reviewed by researchers and entered into the partial record that represents the current state of knowledge about the program. It also contains materials that have been indexed but not yet fully analyzed. A sealed manila folder in the collection sits in its labeled position in the box, accessible in principle through a Freedom of Information Act request. Its contents referenced in the index, but not yet fully examined by the researchers who have passed through the collection over the years since its discovery. What the folder holds is whatever it holds. It was filed by someone who made a filing decision in a year when the significance of the decision was not apparent, and it has sat in its labeled position in the climate-controlled room of the Maryland facility through all the years since, while the investigations proceeded and the hearings convened and the settlements were reached and the compensation claims were filed and adjudicated and paid. The paper inside it has the particular patience of paper that has already outlasted the people who created it. The person who filed it there is gone. The person who knew what it meant to file it in that specific location, who understood why those pages belonged in that folder, in that box, and not somewhere else, is gone. The program it records was formally terminated 50 years ago. The hearing rooms where its existence was acknowledged on the record have had other hearings since, on other subjects, with other officials seated at the witness table and other lights reflected in the long table's surface. The lake in western Maryland has had 50 more winters. The stone building on Mount Royal in Montreal has had 50 more years of ordinary institutional life inside it. The corridors quiet, the windows looking out over the same city. The filing cabinet that held Gottlieb's organized subproject records in 1972 is gone, its contents destroyed. The cabinet itself long since repurposed or discarded. The one-way mirror from the Green Street apartment was removed when the operation closed, leaning against a wall in a storage room, reflecting nothing in particular. The room on its other side was repainted. The address is a building in San Francisco that has no record on its walls of what it once contained. What persists is the partial archive, the 20,000 pages in their labeled boxes, the congressional record of the hearings, the forensic report filed in 1994, the compensation records from the Canadian government's 1992 program, the court documents from the 1988 settlement, the personal diaries of George White, a cloth-covered notebook filled with operational shorthand and observations written in the voice of a man who regarded what he was doing as a bureaucratic assignment rather than an ethical question. The single surviving page of an experimental results section from a sub-project document, whose first and last pages did not survive the shredder. The financial records that confirm a connection between a foundation's letterhead and a classified program, but that describe the research itself in the abstract language of budget line items, rather than the specific language of what occurred in the rooms where the money was spent. The archive is what it is. It holds what it holds. The sealed manila folder in the Rockville collection has been sitting in its labeled position through all the years since the collection was found, since the researchers' Freedom of Information Act request sent someone to look for the box, and the box was found on its shelf in a row of boxes that looked identical from the outside, its label unremarkable, its contents the artifact of a filing decision made long before anyone knew what the decision was preserving. The folder is still there. The climate-controlled room keeps the temperature even. The paper inside does not age the way paper ages in less careful conditions. It waits in the specific patience of a document that has already survived longer than the institution that created it expected anything to survive. Whatever it holds quietly. The building around it is a low commercial structure in a Maryland suburb, indistinguishable from the outside from the other buildings in the district, the kind of place a person could drive past for years without having any reason to stop. The archive inside it is the accident of a filing decision, the residue of a program that tried to leave nothing behind and left 20,000 pages behind instead, stored in the wrong building, overlooked by the administrative sweep that removed everything else. The lake in western Maryland is dark now. The stone building in Montreal is dark. The hearing rooms are empty. The questions that were asked in them in 1975 and 1977 are still in the transcript, still in the record, still sitting in the archive, with the answers that were given and the answers that could not be given because the materials that would have made them possible were gone. The sealed folder rests in its box. The archive rests in its building.